This episode of Proper English is brought to you by Proper English Question Time and the idiom shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. Hello, I'm Dave and I'm flying solo this week, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast, which, as you know, is called Proper English. So, if you're learning English and you want to know the difference between further and father, if you get stuck thinking of when to use shadow or shade, if you're puzzled by the difference between tall and high, then Proper English is just the thing for you. Well, I'm on my own this week. Ali's in the UK for a bit, but she sends her love and she specifically asked me not to get too popular while she's away. Anyway, we were discussing what we could do about Proper English while she's back in Blighty. We've had various conversations, toing and froing over the internet. You could do another one about the weather. Nah, saving that. You could do a compilation episode like they do on American sitcoms. But I kind of felt a bit of a cheapskate doing that. And finally, after racking my brains, I came up with the perfect solution. I could talk about Proper English Question Time and maybe elaborate on some of the answers we've given over the summer. So, here goes. We started Proper English Question Time on Instagram back in July because we were aware that our italki students had a number of questions about English grammar that were relatively easy to answer, ones that wouldn't take up a whole podcast. So we decided to try a couple of questions out on our Instagram page, because you have to have a presence on all the major social media platforms these days, don't you? And it was pretty successful, to be honest. If you haven't done already, search Proper English 2019, or one word, on Instagram and you'll find the answers to 30 odd questions that our students have asked us. Recently, I've started using photographs that I've taken myself as backgrounds for these posts. I do love taking a photograph, me. Anyhow, what I'm going to do today is talk you through some of the answers we've given, starting with what's the difference between father and further? Well, that's a good question, Dave. Thank you, Dave. No, I'm not going to carry on with that. That would be silly. Anyway, let's start with further. Further can be used in a few different ways. It can be used as a verb, meaning to help the progress or development of something. For instance, ooh, I don't trust that one. He'd do anything to further his career. It's worth pointing out here that father, F-A-R-T-H-E-R, cannot be used as a verb unless you spell it without the first R, F-A-T-H-E-R, in which case it can either mean your dad or a verb meaning to be the father of, as in, he fathered 3 children. I'm glad I put that in, to avoid confusion. Further can also be used as an adjective to describe an additional action. Like, if you were following a recipe, it might say something like, once you've brought it to the boil, turn down the heat and then simmer for a further 10 minutes. Something like that. Father and further are pretty much interchangeable when related to physical distance. You can get away with either of these. The walk to the village was much farther than I remember. Or, the walk to the village was much further than I remember. Both work equally well. And you can use further when you're talking about distance in a more figurative way. You could say something like, without further delay, let's move on to the next question. which is, what's the difference between tall and high? Well, tall is usually used to describe something that is narrower than its height, whereas high is for things that have a greater distance from top to bottom. For instance, there are tall pine trees on the slopes of a high mountain. Do you see? Also, we use tall to describe people who are of above average height. Sally is the tallest girl in her class, for instance. High can also be used to indicate something that is beyond our reach. The door handle was too high for him to reach. There's also an idiom that uses high. It's high time. And this one you can use when you're saying it's time to do something that should have been done a while ago, like it's something that you haven't got round to doing. For instance, it's high time we moved on to another question. And this is the last question for now. What's the difference between shadow and shade? Well, usually a shadow is a dark shape or silhouette on a surface created by something that blocks a source of light. Such as, for example, when we were kids, we used our hands to make animal-shaped shadows on the bedroom wall. Yeah, that works. Generally, shade can refer to any dark area caused by blocking sunlight or other light, as in, because it was so hot, we had our picnic in the shade of a huge old oak tree. Shadow can also be used to describe a negatively emotional situation. The loss of his grandmother cast a shadow over his childhood. Quite dark, appropriately enough. Oh, and while I think of it, throwing shade is a relatively new idiom, American in origin, which means to insult someone. But it's subtle. What you say might not appear to be insulting. For instance, your mate might have a new pair of shoes and you don't like them at all. So you say, "Look at your shoes." It's not necessarily a negative comment, but it's kind of dishonest. Shady, if you like. Incidentally, Fraser, an old friend and colleague of mine, summed up the difference between shadow and shade much more succinctly on Facebook in response to our post. He said, number 1, light, and number 2, heat. Now that's nicely concise, Fraser. Thanks for that. Good work. And now it's time for Idiom of the Week.
Idiom of the Week?
If you're trying to prevent a problem that has already happened, quite often we will say we're shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. Now, bolted in this context doesn't mean fastened. It means run away, escaped, just so you know. And it's old, make no mistake. It can be traced back to medieval times. Horses and stables. Kind of a clue, I suppose. But how would you use it? Well, let's think of an example. Installing a burglar alarm after your television has been stolen might seem a bit like shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. And here I am at the end of my first solo episode of Proper English. I hope you've had fun listening in on my little monologue. Please tell everybody you know about us, your friends, your family, anyone who's studying or learning English. And don't forget to like this episode and leave us a nice review and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or Podbean or your favourite podcast app. That way you'll never miss an episode. Or you can email us at properenglish, all one word, at sapo.pt if you have any suggestions for future podcasts or if you just fancy a chat. And, of course, you can join us on Instagram, as I intimated earlier, or you can like our page on Facebook, where you can ask us any questions you might have about English grammar. So, until next time, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from me too. And thank you for listening to Proper English.